Hello. Today we're talking about how to have better boundaries with anyone. This session is all about how to define and start articulating your boundaries. I'm Maria Riegger, your resident Gemini, and this is Positive Parenting with Astrology. I'm a parenting coach, and one of my areas of focus is to help parents have better boundaries with their kids so that they can teach their kids how to have better boundaries for themselves. When kids are taught to self champion, stand up for themselves, when there's open discussion at home, children are much more apt to be emotionally healthy adults when the parents aren't around, and they'll be much more able to articulate their boundaries with others when they're living as independent adults. So that's why I'm so passionate about this topic. And we talk a lot about boundaries on this channel, but we have not really talked yet about how to define what a boundary is, what a boundary is not, and how to articulate your boundaries. So it's an essential subject, and parents really need to get it right for themselves so that they can teach healthy boundaries to their kids. And now, take it from me, as a kid, I was not allowed to have boundaries. I was not allowed to state my own preferences. I was constantly shut down. I was constantly told what to think, what to like, how to behave, what to say. Even when I tried to express a preference, I was always shut down. Um, Later in life, as an adult, unfortunately, I had very poor to non-existent boundaries, even with other adults well into adulthood. It that unfortunately led me to allow other people to take advantage of me because I would not stand up for myself. It's important to understand that when you do not articulate no, you are articulating a default yes. It is very important to say no and to be very clear about that. And we'll get to that here in a bit. But my point is, if us parents do not teach our children healthy boundaries and do not allow our kids to self champion at home, they will more than likely grow up into adults who have poor boundaries, who are bandied about by the whims of others because they cannot say no. And clearly, we don't want that for our kids. As an adult, what happens when we say yes to things that we really want to say no to, or we do not say a definite no, and that basically translates to a default yes? Many times when we do that, we say yes to something we really don't want to do, or we commit to things we really don't want to commit to. We end up exhausted, we end up resentful, and that also negatively affects our relationships. So, by upholding our boundaries, while it is an uncomfortable process to start, and you may even lose some people in your life who are used to being entitled to your time and energy, that's not a bad thing. You will get to the point where you are comfortable articulating and enforcing your boundaries on a consistent basis. And when you do that, you have more time and energy for yourself and for your family. I'm going to cite an example right now that is not necessarily family friendly. So we usually try to be family friendly on this channel, but you may not want your kids to listen to this, just FYI. There is a documentary, a true crime documentary on Netflix. It's called Don't Pick Up the Phone. And I will try to briefly summarize this true crime documentary. It's about a hoax caller who would call fast food restaurants pretending to be from the local law enforcement office. And he would tell the managers, essentially he would tell the managers, he would identify an employee who worked at the restaurant, the fast food place, and he would tell the manager that they were investigating this employee for possible theft, and they wanted the manager to talk to this employee and interrogate this employee about the possible theft, usually money or something else. The manager, because people are conditioned to do what authority tells them to do without too much thought a lot of the time, they're conditioned to take orders from people like military people or teachers or law enforcement. The managers would go call the employee in and start to interrogate them. After the interrogation concluded, the pretend police officer would say, well, now I need you to search this employee's clothing. Now I need you to search this employee's locker. Now I need you to, I kid you not, this really happened. Now I need you to kiss this employee to see if they have alcohol on their breath. Basically, without getting too much into it, these hoax acts escalated. And the hoax caller had the manager do more and more degrading things to the employee, things that I don't really want to talk about, culminating in sexual assault. Now, if you don't believe me, go see the documentary. It is crazy. It's like truth is stranger than fiction. One of the victims was a 17-year-old minor, obviously, minor girl. And the police asked her, why did you participate in these acts, which were so clearly, this was not, I mean, now thinking about it, Monday morning quarterbacking, you're thinking, obviously a real police officer would not ask a manager to do these things. Why did you submit to them? Why didn't you say no when the manager asked you to do these things that were clearly like beyond the scope of any law enforcement investigation? And she said, well, I'm from a military family. My father is military, and he taught me to always obey adults and always do what adults told me with no question, that adults knew better than me. Okay, this is an example, an extreme example of what can happen when we do not allow our kids to express any boundaries or have any say in anything that happens to them at home. This is the risk of that. It's extreme risk, yes. Doesn't always happen, clearly. But the risk is that the kids grow up. This woman, I mean, was almost a legal adult. The risk is that kids grow up into adults who believe that anyone in any perceived position of authority over them knows better than them, and they have to obey that person. How many people have we heard about in the news that use the excuse, well, I was just following orders. I was just following orders. I mean, that's no excuse. You're a human being with free will. You have to think. This is the main reason why I absolutely abhor groupthink and why I am such a rugged individualist. I don't understand why the term individualism has become a bad thing. I cannot stand the groupthink, this herd mentality, this idea that, well, if the herd is doing it, it must be okay, right? No. It's the main reason I don't like the Greek system in colleges. I don't like sororities and fraternities. My college did not have a Greek system. No offense if some of you guys were in a fraternity or a sorority and you had a really good experience, that's fantastic. But anytime you put these young kids who still have, not great impulse control because the brain is not fully formed yet at 18 or 19 or 20 or 21, you put them in this group house living together with no adult, I mean, technically they're adults, but no supervision from people who do have better impulse control, right? You have the risk of that herd mentality, that groupthink. So this is why this is so important to get right. Just because everybody else is doing something does not mean it is the right thing to do. I had this discussion with my son, the principal of my son's old school. The principal is ex-military, and I had an issue with how they, disciplined the kids, and they were being too regimented. And he said, well, in the military, you tell soldiers something and they just do it right away. They don't explain. Okay, well, this school is not a war. It's not a site of war. It's not a military environment. Okay, and I told the principal, you know what? When my son is older and he's in a situation where everybody around him is doing something terrible, he has to be the one that stands up and says, no, we're not doing this. This is wrong. So he has to be the person to go against the groupthink. That's how I'm raising him. To question authority. Yes, even to question my authority. I'm not always right. But my point with these examples is to show you an extreme way that which poor boundaries can manifest if we don't get this right as parents. We don't have to get it right 100% of the time. But we should not be shutting our kids down when they try to engage with us, including quote unquote talking back, which I don't like to use that term because it has a negative connotation. We should allow kids to have an open dialogue and communication with us, including explaining themselves when we quote unquote catch them doing something they shouldn't be doing. Maybe there's a reason for it. You never know. Okay, so here's the structure of what we're going to talk about today. We're gonna go over a couple more things, explaining why boundaries are so important to teach now. We're going to define what is a boundary and what it is not, and I'm going to show you how to get started on this journey if you have had trouble deciding and articulating your boundaries. Number one, why are boundaries so important? Well, there are a lot of toxic and entitled people out there. And I don't necessarily think that there are more toxic and entitled people out there than in previous generations. I think it's a tough call. I think social media makes it easier for those people to be visible. So I'm not necessarily sure that social media creates toxic people. It's probably more likely that toxic people just have a better outlet and more visibility with social media. But nevertheless, there are a lot of people who will take advantage of us if we let them. If you follow Dr. Romani on YouTube, who's a really well-known psychotherapist specializing in narcissistic abuse recovery, she estimates that 1 of every 6 people qualifies as a clinical narcissist, somebody who meets the DSM criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. Now, that's an estimate, right? Because we don't know exactly, we can't really know how many people exist that qualify for that disorder, because most people that qualify for NPD do not seek treatment. But that's her estimate. That's terrifying. That doesn't even count other people who qualify for other cluster B personality disorders or other toxic people that may not qualify for a diagnosis of NPD. That's a lot. 1 out of 6 is a lot. Then you have people who qualify for antisocial personality disorder or sociopathy. They just don't care about your boundaries. Then you have people who may qualify for borderline personality disorder. Arguably, that's only 1 to 2% of the population. Again, we really don't know. But they can't regulate enough to respect your boundaries just because they cannot regulate. Then you have people who have ADHD. Nothing bad with that. That's not a personality disorder. It does not mean they're toxic. But a lot of people with ADHD have very poor impulse control. It's just part of the illness, part of the way the brain is structured. Not everyone who has an ADHD diagnosis has poor impulse control, but a lot of them do. And even though they know and understand and respect your boundaries, in the moment, sometimes it's hard to control the impulses, and the impulse they may have may lead them to violate your boundary, even though that's not the intention. So my point with saying all this is to tell you and show you how important it is for you to decide what your boundaries are and to articulate your boundaries and to enforce your boundaries. Now, aside from toxic people that we've talked about, there are also people who are not necessarily toxic, but nevertheless, because of their relationship to you, feel entitled to your time and energy. And if you have not done a good job of defining and articulating and enforcing your boundaries in the past, you have essentially trained these people to be entitled to your time and energy. And often the people closest to us feel the most entitled. Not always, but that could even include a romantic partner. Sometimes they feel entitled to our time and energy. For example, in some of my support groups, I know women who feel responsible for waking their partners up on time to get to work. That's not my responsibility. It's not my responsibility to wake up my husband to get him ready for work on time. That's his responsibility. Likewise, it's not my kid's responsibility to make sure the adults get up on time for work. It's the adult's responsibility. So it can be, it's a risk to be enmeshed like that with your partner, especially in your more of a maternal role. But this is where boundaries become very important, because you have to decide what is your responsibility and what is not. But my point is that sometimes people, because of the close relationship, feel entitled to our time and energy and entitled to us doing things for them that are really not our responsibility. This happens a lot with children or parents of adult children. The parents feel entitled to the time and energy of the adult children. They feel entitled to time with the grandkids. It's harder sometimes for a lot of these adult children to state those boundaries with their parents because of the relationship, but you are still allowed to have boundaries with those close to you, okay? Your boundaries are personal to you. Nobody has the right to define your boundaries for you or tell or decide they're unreasonable but you. If you do not decide your boundaries and you do not prioritize your life, other people will do that for you. Other people will decide your boundaries or lack of boundaries for you, and other people will prioritize your life by default. Now, two more quick points. Obviously, we're in an age where people are connected 24/7, and sometimes they feel entitled to responses and communications from us 24/7. They're not entitled to that, okay? So it is essential that we maintain those boundaries for ourselves so that we can model good boundaries for our kids. For example, a big thing with teens is texting your friends. Well, we have to teach our teens your friends are not entitled to an immediate response from you. They're not entitled to be in contact with you 24/7. You can put the phone down. You can just not respond. We have to model that too. Okay, so next we're going to talk about what is a boundary exactly. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this. A boundary is personal to you. It is not a limit or a general rule. For example, we have a rule in my house. Midweek during the week, school nights and work nights, all electronics get turned off at 9 p.m. It's a reasonable rule. There's a reason for it. Clearly, health and safety, sleep hygiene. It's a good rule. It's a reasonable rule. It's a healthy rule. It's an appropriate rule. But it's a rule. It's a general rule. It's not a boundary. Okay. Now, it can become confusing because a rule can kind of be associated with the boundary. Like if my kid says, oh, please, can I just have my phone on till 10? And I say, no. Please, Mom, please, can I have my phone on till 10? No, I said no. Please, 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 just till 10, just till 9:45, please. No, you know the rule is at 9. Please stop badgering me. If you continue to ask me the same question I've already answered several times, I will leave the room or I will not talk about this anymore, whatever. That's enforcing the boundary. Where enforcing the boundary comes in. But now this is no longer a general rule. Now the situation is involving a personal boundary because I am being badgered and I am feeling stressed. So a good rule of thumb is if you are starting to feel really emotionally triggered, chances are it's because your personal boundary of yours is being violated or somebody is starting to cross over your personal boundary. So that's a kind of a good rule of thumb. If you start to feel emotionally triggered, chances are it's because somebody's trying to violate your boundary. And again, it may not necessarily mean anything nefarious by it. Yeah, my kid just wants extra time on the phone, but the rule is this, and you're badgering me, and I don't like to be pressured. Me being pressured, I don't like that. I don't like to be pressured. That's my boundary. I don't like to be asked the same question repeatedly when I have already answered it several times. That's a personal boundary. So one way you can think about this is to think about just like you have a property line around your house protecting your property that you own, that you have a right to, you have the right to have a personal boundary around yourself. So physical boundaries is easy to conceptualize physical boundaries. I don't like to be touched. I don't like to be touched on the face. I don't like to be hugged or whatever. Those are easy to conceptualize. It's more challenging to conceptualize emotional boundaries, mental boundaries, psychological boundaries. Financial boundaries are another big one. People asking you for money. Other people are not entitled to your money, okay? So the way I like to think about emotional boundaries, psychological boundaries, mental boundaries are to think about what is your responsibility and what is not. Where do you end and the other person begins? This is very liberating. It's a liberating process because you think about what is not your responsibility and you make the decision, oh, X is not my responsibility. I don't have to do this. And that's very liberating. So I'm going to give you an example about like an emotional boundary. Okay. So years ago, I met a lady through a mutual friend. And I guess this lady had heard I was an attorney and I had done pro bono work in the past, which years ago I used to do pro bono work for the county for people who could not afford legal assistance because it's very expensive to get divorced and do a will and all that stuff. So this lady texted me and said, oh, I had some issue where I'm being sued on this contract for debt. It was a debt related suit. And she asked me some questions, some general questions. And I answered, well, this and this, not providing legal advice because I didn't know the extent of her case and the details of it. And I told her, you can check with the county, with this office at the county. They provide free legal assistance to people to meet the income limitations. This lady was working full time and did not meet the income limitations for free advice. So she texted me several more times, asking very detailed questions, and I would answer very generically. And then she kept texting and she asked me more specific questions. And at the time I was going through a divorce, my first divorce. I was getting ready to sell my old house. I was dealing with my son, who was very young at the time, trying to provide him support. I was stressed. I was trying to take care of myself. And I have this lady asking me for free legal advice. On top of all this, I'm working my full-time job. So one day she texted me and I just texted her back and I said, I am not able to help you. Best of luck with this. And she got angry and she texted me this tirade of this wall of text, right? And she said, well, you said you were a pro bono attorney, as if that entitles you to my free legal help, like that, as if that entitled this lady to my free labor. Seriously? After I spent like 6 figures putting myself through law school. She said, well, you said you were a pro bono attorney and I didn't want free legal help. Quote, I just wanted your guidance, unquote. Lady, I gave you my general guidance. You didn't just want my guidance. You wanted free legal help. I guarantee that if I would have said, oh yeah, I'll draft motions for you and I'll do this and I'll research this for you, she would have gladly accepted my help. Okay? But I made the decision, I am not responsible for this. I am not responsible for helping this lady. I'm not responsible for giving her any advice, generic or specific. And I'm not responsible for providing her pro bono legal assistance. And I got angry that she got angry, but that's a good example of something that is clearly not my responsibility. So this lady, she could have hired her own attorney, but she didn't. She didn't want to spend money. In fact, she had a friend of hers like drafting motions, and he had told her to settle the case and then got upset with her when she didn't want to settle. Well, he didn't have good boundaries. He got drawn into this case and he started helping her with the case and writing and drafting and filing motions, and he should not have done that. He's just said, if you want me to do that, here's my rate. But that's not that's not my responsibility. That's for him to deal with. But that's a good example of something that is more of a emotional, psychological boundary. I'm going to give you another example. And that first example is an example of what I like to call a defensive boundary. Clearly, you've been triggered, right? Somebody is actively trying to violate your boundaries. And then you have to defend. In my case, I had to tell her, I cannot help you with this. This next example is more an example of a proactive boundary. It's not that somebody is trying to, not that somebody feels entitled to my time. They're just oblivious. Again, it's a good example of the fact that people will not magically know your boundaries. They will not magically know your situation. You have to take charge of that. You have to take control of deciding and articulating and enforcing your boundaries. So in this next example, again, years ago, before I became a mom, I was working at a field office, a government field office, and we saw the public, and we did interviews all day with people, members of the public. They were applying for benefits. And we were very busy, and I had interviews scheduled like at 10:30, 11:30, and 12, and then my boss said, I have this 12:30 for you. It should be quick. I said, great. I finished it, and then he said, I have this 1 o'clock for you. And I said, okay. And I took that, and then he said, are you done with that one? The 1 o'clock? I said, yeah, I finished talking to them. Well, I have one more for you. And I stopped him, and I said, when would you like me to take my lunch break? And he said, oh, you haven't had lunch yet? I said, no, because I had an appointment set at 10:30, and that took almost an hour. Then I had one at 11:30, then I had one at 12, and then you gave me a 1 o'clock, and a 12:30 and a 1 o'clock, and now you want to give me 1:30. He said, oh, well, then take your lunch now. Now, it wasn't like, I'm pretty sure he did not make the decision, well, I'm going to make sure Maria doesn't get lunch, blah, blah. No, he's just oblivious. He wasn't carrying around everybody's particular schedule in his mind all day, right? He was just oblivious. But it was up to me to say, yo, I need a lunch break. Like, I know we have work to do, but I have the right to have a lunch break. My boundary was, I'm not going to go without having lunch. If you know me, you know I eat every like couple hours. So, man, I'm not going to skip meals. You do not want to see me hangry. I just asked my family. So that's a good example of a more proactive boundaries. He was just oblivious, right? He wasn't trying to be like, I'm gonna give you work because I don't like you. I don't want you to have lunch. He was just oblivious. At least that's what I think. So but it's a really good example of the fact that it is up to you to proactively state your boundaries. Us codependents, a lot of the time, we wait for the other person to recognize our needs. We wait for the other person to recognize, oh, that we have boundaries and that we have needs. And then when those people don't meet our needs and they don't respect our boundaries that we have failed to communicate, we get angry. But it is our responsibility to communicate that. Okay. And we have to work past and through the initial discomfort, right, at articulating and enforcing those boundaries. So, one more important point, boundaries, as you probably have guessed already, they're not about controlling other people. They're not about controlling other people's behavior. I refuse, I don't want you to ever do that again. That's not a boundary. Okay. For example, some of my support groups for people who have been in toxic relationships, the people will say things like, "Oh, my ex wanted me to wear a certain outfit because they liked how it looked, and then they got mad when I didn't wear that outfit." That's a rule control. That's somebody's effort to control somebody else. That's not a personal boundary. And you need to be really careful because toxic people a lot of the times will try to control you with a rule like that, and they will call it a personal boundary, and they will say they will say to the victim, you don't respect my boundaries. That's not a boundary. Insisting that your partner wear a certain outfit that they don't want to wear because it's not comfortable or for whatever reason, insisting they want to wear a certain outfit because you like how it looks, and in your opinion, they're going to look better on your arm when you're out in public. That's not a personal boundary. That's controlling somebody else's behavior. So toxic people are very good at doing that, at manipulating the other person and making them think that the toxic person is articulating a personal boundary when it's not. It's a rule to control the other person. It's not a personal boundary. So you have to pay a lot of attention sometimes, and when you begin this process, if you have not been good in the past at setting your boundaries, you have to really pay attention. And that's where detachment comes in. If you want to watch my video on how to detach emotionally from anyone, I talk about how to detach and get the distance to be able to actually realize what's going on so that then you can set your boundaries. Detachment is that first step, and before you start to really think about and set and enforce your boundaries. But a boundary is not about controlling somebody else's behavior. Like if I told my kid, I don't want you to wear that tonight. I want you to wear that because it looks nicer. Not a boundary. It's a rule. I'm trying to control somebody else. Okay, that's not a boundary. Boundaries are personal to you. Think of your personal protective shield. Now, ideally, boundaries are like, one author calls it kind of like a wall with gates, or a mesh wall. You want to keep out the bad, so to speak, and you want to let in the good, right? You don't want to be avoidant. That's more advanced. I don't want you to think about that yet. If you have not been good at setting boundaries in the past, I want you to think first about setting your own boundaries and saying no. And when you're good at that, and when you feel empowered and you feel a lot more comfortable with that process, saying no instead of saying yes when you don't want to say yes, then you can think about, am I being too avoidant now, or am I hitting this just right? So that's a more advanced process, but I want you to take this one step at a time. So for now, I want you to practice saying no. And when you say no, obviously say no when you want to say no, not just say no to say no, right? When somebody asks you to do something and you just don't want to do it or you can't commit to it, say no. Say no with as few words as possible. Don't offer explanations, because those of us who grew up with a lot of childhood abuse and emotional and psychological abuse, we were not allowed to have boundaries, and we grew up in a way that made us very defensive, right? We were constantly questioned. We were not allowed to self-champion. And it gave us a propensity, certainly did for me, to over-explain, like to feel very defensive about always having to explain and over-explain ad nauseum our position. Like, well, I'm doing this because X. And I used to do this when people would say, well, can you do X tonight? I would say, no. I have plans. What are you doing? Well, I'm going to, watch TV. Well, if you says you're not doing anything, you can do this. Well, no, I am doing something. I'm relaxing and watching TV. And I got really good at just not explaining, at just saying, no, I'm not able to do that. So in your process of beginning to set your boundaries, I want you to start by saying no with as few words as possible. No, I'm not able to. No, can't do it. And if people close to you especially tend to do this, well, why not? Because I'm not able to. Don't offer explanations. You do not owe anyone an explanation as to why you can't do something. Maybe your partner, depending on the situation, but that's it. But you don't owe anyone an explanation as to why you don't want to use your energy for this or why you don't want to commit to something, okay? So if people get really inquisitive about this and start to pressure you, which I hate, you can say, look, I just said I can't do this. Why are you asking me for more info? Or you can say, I've already answered this. This subject is closed. And if they continue to pressure you, I said this subject is closed. If you continue to ask me this question I've already answered, I'm going to leave the room or I'm going to hang up the phone. And if they continue to do that, to pressure you, hang up the phone, leave the room. In another more advanced session, we're going to talk about enforcing your boundaries. And by enforcing, I mean stating a consequence and then following through on the consequence. When I talk about enforcing your boundaries, that's what I mean. Because some people, you could state your boundaries ad nauseum, but they will violate them every time. You have to enforce your boundaries. But for now, work on saying the no. And I want you to find somebody you can consider a constant. Somebody who is really good at stating their boundaries and enforcing their boundaries. Somebody who is really good at saying no, who has ironclad boundaries, who doesn't get uncomfortable or defensive. And I want you to observe them and see how they do it. That's a really good way of learning how to set boundaries and feeling more comfortable setting boundaries. If you have not been great about setting boundaries in the past and enforcing boundaries, you could expect some people to be upset. That's okay. Forget them. Okay? They're going to be upset. If they're used to being entitled to your time and energy, this is going to be different for them. You are going to have to work through the initial discomfort when people get upset with you. And the people who are really toxic will eventually fall away, and that's what you want. You don't want them around if they don't have your best interests at heart, okay? And if people are going to be upset about you enforcing your boundaries, you don't want them around anyway. But my point is, you're going to have some initial discomfort in doing this. That's okay. But you will get better and better at it, and you will feel, in addition to the discomfort, simultaneously, you will also feel empowered and you will feel really good. You will feel really good about stating your boundaries, about saying no and holding fast to them. And the more you do that, the better you get at it, the less discomfort you have, the more empowered you feel. And the bonus is that you will have more energy to handle the vicissitudes of life, and you will have more energy for yourself and for your kids. And you are setting a great example for your kids. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I have an in-depth advanced masterclass on this subject that is available on my Patreon page. If you are interested, the link is below, and thank you for your attention.